Okay, so what I'm here to speak about today is a little bit of a general overview of the future of clinical trials. I'm going to set the stage for all the additional presentations you're going to hear as we move forward. And so this, as I mentioned, is just general. It's not going to go into great detail, but I am available for some questions if people have them later. Okay, always have to put the disclaimer in. This is my opinion, no one else's opinion but mine. All right, been doing this, as Helen mentioned, for the last 25 years. And what I find interesting is I've seen it go up and down through the years, and many of the things that we think are new now might have been new 25 years ago, that type of thing. But what I'm talking about right now is currently where we're at. And so the question arises, is it status quo? Are we doing the same things we've always done, or are we seeing some changes coming about? And I'm here today to tell you it's a little bit of both. So when we talk about status quo, one of the things that we notice is there's always an increase in cost, an increase in how long it takes to get a product approved. We could say that that is partly due to the fact that, economies change, and as they do, things become more expensive. What we paid for milk, 25 years ago is not what we're paying for today. But also, we're discovering that we're increasing our time to actually get to market. Ken Getz had presented in 2014 a statement that clinical development time is up to 6.8 years to get a product developed to market. And that's up from 6 years from 1999 to 2001. I'm not sure all the reasons why that can be, but I can speculate. For example, we find that studies are much longer than they used to be. They take a lot longer, follow-up time periods are longer. We are asking for many more subjects than we used to ask for. So therefore, that increases the time. And all this makes it so it's taking not only longer, but it then ends up being much more costly to bring a product to market. Costs, this was recently quoted by Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development. They say that they quoted $2.6 billion. Think about it, $2.6 billion to bring a product to market. And this figure is more than 3 times higher than their 2001 estimate of $820 million. Now, I didn't take the time to review these and compare them to their previous survey. One thing I found interesting is this particular organization, Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development, also included what the cost of loss is for not bringing a product to market. So it's not only what it costs you to actually develop the product in regards to preclinical, clinical, that type of thing, regulatory submissions, but also the money you're losing while it's taking a while to get it to market. Remember that previous slide said it's taking 6.8 years just in clinical time alone. And so therefore, that pretty much is the status quo. We're increasing cost, we're increasing time to bring to market. But the thing that has not changed, regretfully, is we're getting the same negative findings when we look at FDA inspections. In particular, I'm going to concentrate on U.S. I have been looking at these for year after year. They started providing metrics, organized metrics that you can easily find on the FDA website back in 2007. You could get it before, but it was a little more difficult. And regretfully, all the negative things that we find that goes on in clinical trials haven't changed. They're the exact same things. They have changed in maybe frequency. One's gone higher than the other in a given year, but the actual citations themselves have not changed. So for example, in 2014, our most common clinical investigator deficiencies included failure to follow the investigational plan and/or regulations. And then they quote second as protocol deviations. I've always found this a little confusing. To me, protocol deviations is not following the investigational plan, so I don't really see what the difference is, but apparently they differentiate at the FDA. We all know that protocol deviations shouldn't occur. We know we're supposed to follow the protocol, but I still run across companies that allow what they call waivers. Interesting, since FDA does not recognize the concept of waivers, but it's still occurring. Inadequate record keeping. That's pretty straightforward. It's self-evident. I don't need to elaborate on that. Inadequate accountability for investigational product. Now, I will say these citations are both for drug, device, biologics, so we're not talking one particular center here, but just as an example, we still do silly things with devices like have salespeople come in and take an investigational product and run it to another facility to use when they shouldn't be doing that. So there's still some inability to track our investigational products. One of the things we know that's going on, particularly in devices now, is we're starting at post-marketing to do identification tracking so we can figure out where our devices go. Apparently we still need to do a better job of that pre-market also. Inadequate communication with the IRB is another area. Now, I'm not saying that clinical investigators are not communicating with their IRBs, but what the FDA finds is it's not documented. So as we know, not documented, not done. That's the FDA stand. When I first started in this industry many years ago, a nice gentleman got up to speak at a conference such as this, and he said, it's FDA 101. So I ran naively to the regulations and started looking up 21 CFR Part 101. Well, there is no such thing. He was teasing me, and it took me a while to figure it out. But basically, if you haven't documented something, it doesn't make any difference how well you've done it. It is not done in the eyes of the FDA or any other regulatory agency. Inadequate subject protection. Failure to report adverse events continues to be an issue at this stage, which always surprises me. Part of it is because companies try to determine themselves of what is or is not an adverse event. From the FDA's perspective, an adverse event is any untoward occurrence that happens during the course of the study. We're not talking about its relationship to your product at this stage. We're just talking about, did something occur? We need to collect it. We need to perform trend analysis. We need to do something that says we've done a very good assessment in regards to whether or not this is related to our product or not. So those are the most common clinical investigator deficiencies. Most common sponsor deficiencies continue to be inadequate monitoring. And that definitely concerns me because we're moving into the age of what we call risk-based monitoring, which means that we're making determinations what pieces we're going to more closely look at versus other pieces within a given study. We haven't even gotten it down straight just with the straight monitoring. Now we're adding complexity to this. Failure to bring investigators into compliance. When I started in the business, many times I would hear, they're a key opinion leader, so therefore we're going to let them get away with this or that. Well, the FDA does not view our investigators as key opinion leaders, and so they become quite firm on this to the point of not only is it in the regulations, which states in the U.S., that if an investigator is non-compliant, it is the responsibility of the sponsor to pull that product and no longer conduct studies with them or that particular study. And we're seeing that more and more in warning letters now. It's starting to crop up. So sponsors are being forced to be part of the three-legged stool. And when I talk the three-legged stool, I'm talking about your sponsor, your clinical investigators, and your IRBs. All people in those three-legged stools are responsible for ensuring safety of subjects and for ensuring that the data that's collected is accurate and reproducible. And so while we are getting, clinical investigators are getting citations for not following the protocol, sponsors are getting citations for not forcing investigators to follow the protocol. Failure to obtain FDA and/or IRB approval prior to study initiation. I suspect that the reason for that cropping up more is in regards to medical devices as opposed to drug research. Drug research is a little more straightforward when we talk about how it's handled here in the U.S. If you conduct a study for drug research, you must go through the FDA in some shape, form, or manner. Whereas with medical devices, if it's a non-significant device, there is the opportunity to just interact with the IRB and not have to go through the FDA in regards to an investigational device exemption application, even though good clinical practice requirements are still apply. So I suspect when we see failure to obtain FDA and or IRB approval, it probably is being brought up on the list due to devices as opposed to drugs. Interestingly enough, in 2013, I believe it was, don't quote me on that because I can't remember exactly if it was 2013 or 14, there were like 13 warning letters for in IRBs, institutional review boards. 13. That's amazing after all this time that we still have IRBs not doing things properly. And the type of things that they're looking for IRBs is inadequate initial and or continuing review of the protocol and investigational plan, inadequate standard operating procedures. For people that are familiar with the U.S. regulations, sponsors are required to have standard operating procedures, and IRBs are required by regulation to have standard operating procedures. Interestingly enough, investigators are not required. But what we're finding is the standard operating procedures at IRBs are inadequate. Inadequate membership rosters. What they mean here is there are certain criteria of number of members and what their expertise and specialties are supposed to be on a given IRB board. And apparently there's some members that they're missing those expertise. Inadequate meeting minutes. Not documented, not done. Quorum issues, meaning they're not having enough people there to have adequate decision making. They expect a minimum of 5. The reason why, your 5 becomes your tiebreaker. Your 5 is, so if you've got 2 that votes one way and 2 another, you've got one person that's going to make the final decision on whether this product gets approved or not for moving forward in the study. Subpart D issues. For you that are not familiar with FDA regulations, Subpart D has to do with pediatrics, so that we're not putting enough pediatric protections in place for children that are in studies. Little bit concerning, number one, they can't safeguard themselves being a child, but also we have a huge push right now to include more pediatric indications within our drugs and our devices, because as we know, children are not just little adults. They actually have different ways that they metabolize, how quickly they metabolize it. Part has to do with their weight, their size, that type of thing. But there's a lot of pediatric concerns still cropping up in IRB warning letters. Inadequate communication with the clinical investigator of the institution. Again, this is probably documentation, I suspect. Partly, though, I also struggle as when I'm working with bringing a site into a particular new project. Sometimes I, as the sponsor, because I act as the sponsor representative, struggle getting the IRBs to define for me what their policies and procedures are. I can't find out, the sites can't find out. That's very concerning to me. Such things as they'll say, we only want to have protocol deviations reported when it affects subject safety. Otherwise, we just want to see them yearly. But in an expedited fashion, we only want to see it when it affects subject safety. But nowhere is it documented what that means. For them, what do they define as something that would affect subject safety? So that's just one example. And then specific to devices, they're also getting cited for lack of or incorrect significant risk versus non-significant risk determination. And that's what I hinted at before. That for some devices, if you have a non-significant risk study that you are developing, then you don't necessarily have to get an investigational device exemption through the FDA prior to commencing that study. And people might be saying, why do I care what devices do? I'm in drug. Well, guess what, folks? It's the wave of the future, and you're going to see many, many more combination products coming out. And in that case, you're going to have to know both regulations. So if you're confused now with one, you get to be double confused with 2. And then the FDA also looked at some international deficiencies. I don't know if you're aware, but for example, the FDA and the European Union have done some co-inspecting together. FDA sent some of their people over there to look and see how the EU does inspections, and EU sent some people here to see how FDA does inspections. Interestingly enough, Cynthia Kleppinger, who is an FDA, one of the FDA people that was involved in the process, did a presentation at Society of Quality Assurance 2 years ago and said, really, we look at the same things. They just might do it in a different manner. So for example, in the European Union, they look at processes. They look at systems closer. Whereas here in the US, the FDA tends to focus on data. But at the end of the day, they're ending up with the same type of citations, which I found that very interesting when she shared that. So the common international deficiencies are very similar to what they saw in the U.S. For sponsor, inadequate monitoring, and failure to bring investigators into compliance. Same thing. For clinical investigators, protocol deviations or not following the investigational plan, inadequate investigational product accountability, and inadequate subject protections. And I've provided the URL for this. This is metrics that the FDA does every year. They've posted them since 2007. There's a lot more metrics there if you're interested in looking at the pretty pie charts and those type of things that you can review. Feel free to look yourself. Now here we also are finding something that is changes. There's changes in legislation going on. And I find this interesting, if not amusing. Here in the U.S. and other developing countries, some of them are trying to decrease the amount of regulation or the amount of rigidity within the regulation, whereas your developing countries are trying to tighten up their regulations. So one of the prime examples I can give you there is we know in India they had some concerns about subject safety and that they're making it much they're looking at more stringent processes to ensure that subjects are being protected. So, for example, in India, you now have to videotape all informed consent processes. That's not required here in the U.S. Okay. And I did want to bring this up because it just happened recently. In July of this year, which is pretty much the month we're in now, the House of Representatives passed the first stage of what's called the United States 21st Century Cures Act. And it's very important to us that are in clinical research. It has not become law yet, so it hasn't gone through the Senate, it hasn't been voted on. This is just the first stage. But what they want to focus on is how do we accelerate approval? How do we get things approved more quickly? the U.S. has always been a kind of a standard that many companies strive for, that they do good work here in the U.S. and that they put enough protections in place for subjects to ensure that things are done ethically and safely. But now we're starting to say we've put too many things in place, at least the House of Representatives believes this, that we've put too many things in place and we need to back off on that. So that what they want to do is require less clinical trials to obtain approval than what we've done in the past. What they're hoping to do, and one of the things they quoted was that Tufts statistics that I talked to you about previously, what they're hoping to do is shorten the time to approval. But what that's doing is taking away what we call the gold standard. So the gold standard in the U.S. used to be that it had to be a scientifically valid, placebo-controlled minimum of 2 studies. I've seen over the years that's starting to get like approximately half of drugs now are able to get through with 1 phase 3 study instead of 2. Part of the reason is they've been increasing the number of subjects within that given study. But still, we've already starting to loosen, and now the U.S. government would like to reduce more. They want to increase the use of clinical evidence from things other than these controlled studies. So, for example, clinical experience, observational studies, registries, therapeutic use. As a CRO, I'm a little concerned about this personally because we work with a lot of small companies. We're not a huge CRO ourselves, and we work with a lot of small companies. Some of these companies are almost virtual in nature. I have one company I've worked with for 10 years where the head of it, every time I get him, I have to make sure he's not out doing the hay. That's the type of thing that I deal with. He's out working the hay for his animals on his farm. They don't really understand the requirements, so he's always coming to me with things that says, here, I've got this clinical evidence, and we should use this to support us moving into studies. And when I read the clinical evidence, it's basically just Dr. So-and-so treated 5 patients with this product. I'm sometimes confused how they get the product because it's not approved yet, but it happens. And they found wonderful things. But there's no data to support it. It's just a statement by the physician that wonderful things went on. So I am a little concerned about things such as clinical experience. The other way we use clinical experience, as we know in the United States of America, FDA does not regulate medical practice. So once a product is approved, then a physician can use it for anything they want, even if it's off-label, and the FDA can't do anything about it. So I know some of the clinical experience they're talking about might be a little more structured within a hospital setting, but the physician is still using it off-label, and we have to wonder, is the right data being collected to ensure that these subjects, that the results of these studies are actually truly what we're looking for and not speculation based on something that occurred during the use of inconsistent clinical experience. Registries are up and coming in the U.S. There's lots of registry studies being pushed out, and then, of course, what we call therapeutic use. This law also will promote the development of treatments based on the individual's genetic data, and I think that's actually a good thing. This is one of the good pieces I like about this proposed law, because as we know, we can take the same product, give it to different people, and they're going to react differently to it, and many times it's based entirely on their genetic data. Other reasons it might be they might have different effects includes everything from lifestyle to what types of food we eat. It also wants to exempt reporting of payments to physicians for educational purposes. The U.S. has passed something that's called the Sunshine Act or Transparency Act. Basically, what they were saying is sponsors were giving so much money to physicians that they weren't comfortable, they being the government, and the public was not comfortable that they were truly non-biased. All right, they were getting paid, so were they actually collecting data to show whether the product was effective or not effective, or were they collecting data and skewing it such a way to make the product look effective when it wasn't? So now they're also saying that some of these payments are ridiculous and they want to do away with having to disclose payments for educational purposes. That has positive and negatives. I mean, some educational purposes are fairly straightforward, such as this. Other ones are a little more clouded, and we can't really say for sure whether or not it's a true educational purpose, and that's why they're being paid, or if they're trying to slip them some money underneath the rug. So that's one of the things that some people that are against this particular law are concerned about. It's going to increase additional FDA funding. I think that's long overdue. FDA needs more money. There's no question of it. I don't think they're squandering their money. They're being asked to go in many directions at once. I think we find that in all countries. We have very tight regulations that we expect our regulatory bodies to enforce, but we're not giving them enough money and manpower to do so. It is also made, one of the things they want to do is add $8.75 billion of research funding to the National Institute of Health over the next 5 years. And this would include a mandate for NIH to set up a clinical trial data pilot program with the objective to create a repository of all data from clinical trials. And what they're trying to do here is provide this information out to the general public in such a way that they will be able to use this information to access for future research. They'll say, oh, look at this study. This didn't work. Maybe we need to look at this endpoint or this surrogate point, that type of thing. The pilot program, if this was passed as it stands, would be scheduled to run for 7 years and then could be revoted and adopted as permanent at that time. It mandates, in order to do this though, we're going to need to ensure that we have standardization of data, because if you've got one study looking at data one way and another looking at another, you're not going to be able to compare the results. Another thing that I found interesting is we're saying that, other countries are getting things to market faster. In particular, I know that seems to be one of the things that I hear a lot from device companies. EU gets products to medical device approvals much faster than we do. But this particular graph, which was done in 2015 by the Life Science Connect, pretty much shows that the approval times are tending to merge. So back in 2004, for example, whoops, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that was going to do that. Let me go back. In 2004, I'm trying to figure out which, Canada took a lot longer of 1,000 days to get a product approved, but now it's down to 400. So this was just a comparison of Europe, the United States, Japan, Canada, Switzerland, Australia. So we're talking about developed countries here. We're not speaking about, underdeveloped or emerging markets, but they're coming closer together. So I'm always curious where government, such as the U.S., gets these figures that says, well, we need to compete with other people because we are coming much closer together, at least within developed countries. Now, another thing that is going to be the wave of the future is personalized medicine. And basically, this is the FDA definition, so I'm going to read it as is. The term personalized medicine is often described as providing the right patient with the right drug at the right dose at the right time. More broadly, personalized medicine, which is also known as precision medicine, may be thought to be the tailoring of medical treatment to the individual characteristic needs and preferences of all patients during all stages of care, including prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and follow-up. If you have an elderly family member that you're helping care for, you see that this occurs even within them. A drug that they could take when they were in their 20s at a certain dosage, as they get older, they can't tolerate it anymore. Certain genetic things will make a difference in regards to whether or not a product works or not. And as I mentioned before, lifestyles, food, that type of thing. So personalized medicine is supposed to help tailor such things as medical decisions and practices. And the optimal therapies is going to be based, as I mentioned, on genetic content or other molecular and cellular analyses, such as proteomics, genomics, I can never say this, folks, metabolomics, and which it will help enable the understanding at the molecular level. We're going to see increased use of adaptive trial designs moving forward. This allows modifications to trials and or statistical procedures of ongoing clinical trials. The goal is to be able to adapt the trial as we move forward without undermining the trial validity and the integrity. And there are 3 design methods, and I'll go through them quickly for people that have an interest. There's first what we call the prospective adaptation. And that's something that we do up front. We determine up front that if we find out this information, we're going to adjust in this manner. And it's called by design adaptation, and that concludes such things as adaptive randomization, stopping a trial early due to safety, futility, or efficacy at interim analysis. We've quite a few years ago introduced the concept of data safety monitoring boards here in the U.S. that allows people to look at data in a real-time manner, unblinded while still keeping the sponsor blinded, to say, wait a minute, this isn't safe, we need to stop the study, or look, our treatment is so much better than what we're doing as standard of care that we're actually saving lives, so we might need to stop this sooner. It also is dropping of inferior treatment groups and also includes sample size re-estimation. Then we have what we call the concurrent adaptation. This has occurred all the time. We've done this for years. This is nothing new. It's not normally done. It wasn't originally planned for, but during the course of the study, we discovered something that said we need to make adjustments. Inclusion-exclusion criteria was so tight that we had to go and loosen it up in order to get subjects in, as a simple example. Evaluability criteria might be something we change. Dose regimen and treatment duration. So while some of these are what we've done all along, there's some additional ones, such as the dose regimen and treatment duration, changing your hypotheses. We started with this hypothesis, and as we did some interim analysis, we discovered that isn't holding true, and we need to revise our hypotheses of the study, and then changes in final study endpoint. And then there's also retrospective adaptations, where modifications or changes are made to the statistical analysis plan. But please remember, still, prior to unblinding of the data, prior to breaking of the treatment codes. Another thing that we seem to see that's on a rise across the world is clinical trial transparency. So, for example, in the European Union, they've established a database called the IDRA-CT, and they want to allow this. It's by law, but they're still working out the issues, and they want to allow this to be out there so, again, other people can go into these databases, see what's been done, what hasn't been done, and develop their trials accordingly. But the EMA, which is the European Medical Association, is trying to place restrictions on this law that was just passed. So we're not out of the water yet, and we're not sure where this is going. So currently, they would allow registered users to view data on computers, but they're going to prohibit them from being able to download the data, save the data, edit the data, photograph, printing, distributing, or transferring the information. Now, they're doing that to try to protect the companies that have spent all the time and money in putting this into place and have proprietary information. Flip side is, it kind of defeats the whole purpose of the database to begin with. If you can't use that data to adjust your study, if you're just doing it by reading it, there's not a simple way to say, oh, we need to look at it from this way and adjust the data points. There's a huge push, as I mentioned before, for a harmonization of common data elements, because if you report in one country as man and woman, and in another country as male and female, I mean, that's a simplistic example, but if we don't standardize how we call those things, it makes it very difficult from a statistical perspective to compare. So they want to standardize how we report data. And it's also, NIH is currently proposing a publication of additional clinical trial data, and they also want us, besides what the US is already doing, which is clinicaltrials.gov, they also want us to put in the trial results and all adverse events. And this is regardless of whether the trial was successful or failed. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of companies that are fighting this because they believe that, they're not going to be, it's going to make them look bad in their stockholders' place. I'm almost finished here, folks. We have some continued emphasis on subject privacy. That is continuing to be a huge topic as far as the public goes. So back in 1996, HIPAA came into place, which is a Health Protection something Act. I can never remember it. I can remember the acronyms better. But one of the things we're finding is, even though it's been around for a while, there are institutions still interpreting this differently than what we're used to. I want to take a pause here. Did our other speakers show up? Okay, so I'm going to continue, folks. Okay. So I'll give you a simple example. I had one of our auditors come to us very upset because at a site, the institution had determined that no psychiatric medical records would be made available to the general physician population within the hospital. So what they were saying is, if they were a psychiatrist and they were treating the subject, they could see that medical records, but a gastroenterologist could not. You'd think, well, why would they need to see that? That's a privacy issue. Well, in this particular study, what had occurred is the patient had written a letter, and the patient had a history of depression and suicidal thoughts in the past. The patient wrote a letter, sent it to the investigator, and said, I took your product, and now I want to commit suicide because of it. That's basically what the letter said. We didn't even know that the subject had a psychiatric history, even though it was required that they, not have such things as suicide prior to entering the study. Not only didn't we know, the clinical investigator didn't know, because the institution would not allow him access to those records. So HIPAA is becoming so tightly defined because of fines that institutions are put on if they release this private information, that now even our clinical investigators cannot get full access to all medical records for our subjects. That's a little concerning to me. I'm not sure if you feel the same way. And then in 2012, European Commission proposed a privacy reform that they're trying to get through finally in 2015. Government works slowly. I don't care where you're located. Okay. And the objectives there are to give individuals control over their personal data and to simplify regulatory environment for businesses. So we have this continued emphasis, and I think you're going to see even more tightening on subject privacy. Another thing that's occurring quite frequently is an emerging of more regions for research. And that's good news for us, right? Because the more places we have that we can go do studies, the easier we'll be able to find subjects. Some of those regions include Asia Pacific, Central Europe, Latin America, and Middle East. We used to avoid those because we thought that they were too lax in some of their good clinical practices. We were concerned were subjects being properly given informed consent, as a simple example. But now we're starting to get concerned that these same countries' regulations are getting so tight that we don't want to go there. So we're still struggling with how to adapt these emerging regions into our research, but we're hoping soon that that will become more straightforward. What's some benefits of emerging regions? Well, obviously it opens up availability to collect data from a larger subject populations. It can be much less expensive. U.S. is very expensive to conduct studies. And there's a greater naive subject population, meaning that they've been less studied and you're more able to make sure that the studies as their study results as they're presented are accurate not being influenced by other studies or drugs they were on. Risks. There's lack of ability to maintain long-term subject follow-up. I just taught a course last week where someone was telling me that in one of the countries they work with, it was a nonprofit organization, subjects have to walk for over a week, to get to the hospital for their follow-up visits. Now, is that going to be a little concerning if you're trying to conduct a study there? Do you think you might have a huge dropout during the course of the study? Yes. Another risk is the question of the ability to generalize data on more diverse populations. As we mentioned, genetics can affect how a product works. So now can we compare from country to country? Not necessarily. Lack of or inconsistent standards. I worked in Armenia 2 years ago and was looking for good clinical practice, not U.S. regulation features, but good clinical practice, asked to see something written by their ethical committee in regards to approval for the study, and was basically told, we don't do that. Okay. Inability to standardize trial approach across all sites, and then of course the political turmoil that's going on in some of these emerging countries makes it difficult for us because subjects that could be there one day might not be there the next. There's also a continued increase in outsourcing. The pros are it can cut costs for the sponsors, it can extend the capacity or reduce it as needed as workloads fluctuate, and you can leverage expertise and experience of those vendors that you might not have, especially if you're a startup company. Some of the cons is there's a regulatory compliance risk. I don't know if you're aware, but here in the U.S., FDA has no control over CROs when they do medical device studies, because it's not written in the regulations. They do in drug, but not in device. Okay. And then there's a business risk. We have to be willing to do robust vendor management if we're going to use outsourced groups. And then there's a lot of technological advances, and this is I kept this towards the end because we've all seen it. We all are experiencing it. I can't keep up with it myself. But the purpose of such of these things is to speed up trial conduct, not only at the beginning of the study, but throughout, is to streamline transmission of clinical trial data, hopefully cut down on some of those transcription errors, to change how studies are monitored, that's the whole risk-based monitoring aspect in the US, and to save money. So some new electronics are adoption of electronic medical records. As I mentioned, there's some good things and bad things about that. The bad I've talked about. Some of the good could be that you should be able to easily access that information. I know that monitors are struggling getting access to it, but somebody should be able to get access. Electronic informed consent here in the U.S. is a new thing that we're still experimenting with and starting on. Electronic submissions will be the wave of the future. Remember those standardized data points I was talking about before? You're going to need them to do electronic submissions. Remote monitoring. So now we can do monitoring from a remote location. We don't have to necessarily be on site. That's going to be dictated entirely by the institution's policies on what they will or will not release to you. And of course, you being a sponsor would be very dependent on what they release to you. You have to assume they're releasing the full record. Okay. E-source, and I'm not talking here about electronic medical records. I'm talking about where you'll be able eventually to pull data directly from a machine, let's say an EKG machine, directly into your database. You'll have to skip that whole transcribing and who did it right. We're not there yet, folks. We're not there, but that's where we're going. That's the wave of the future. E-trial master files, we're seeing many more of those. Some sites love it, some sites hate it. But basically what it allows is for a cloud-based central location of your trial master things, so master file records, so that you shouldn't ideally get multiple calls from the sponsor asking for that same document that you've sent 30 times, because it's in the cloud, which includes cloud-based data storage and also eventually cloud-based analytics. And interactive software. I just wanted to mention this, and I'm not touting this in any way, but for example, recently Apple's Research Kit, which is a software medical platform, was released, and you can, subjects can enter data through iPhone, is my understanding. This I'm just going to touch briefly on. If you have an interest in how does quality management systems work for clinical trials, I'll be speaking on this tomorrow morning. But basically what it's talking about is that organizations need to start doing things right up front. In the past, we historically have gone and done our quality assurance activities, our auditing at the end of the trial. Well, guess what? It's too late. So now we need to start introducing something earlier, so hopefully we can reduce those citations that have been ongoing from the FDA and other regulatory agencies for many years. But it also includes the concepts of understanding and applying risk management and corrective and preventative action systems. And that is my presentation, and I tried to stretch it for an hour. I apologize. And so any questions I can try to answer now. Don't put me on the spot.